Hi everyone again. Thank you for joining today's webinar entitled Moving from Evidence to Action, Highlights of the 2016 Handwashing Think Tank. My name is Hannah Woodburn, and as the Secretariat Director of the Global Public-Private Partnership for Handwashing, I want to welcome you to this webinar in which we'll discuss the highlights from the 2016 Handwashing Think Tank. You can go to the next slide, please. So 2 weeks ago, the PPPHW, which is my organization, along with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and WaterAid, convened a meeting of handwashing experts to discuss major themes in handwashing right now, including integration, environmental settings and cues, and scale and sustainability. At this webinar, we are going to review key outcomes from the think tank and then also allow ample time for you to ask questions of the panelists. And I will be your facilitator today. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I am the Secretariat Director of the Global Public-Private Partnership for Handwashing. We are a coalition of organizations who promote handwashing with soap as a way to end preventable childhood death from diseases such as diarrhea and pneumonia. You can see the logos of our steering committee members here. Our steering committee is comprised of Colgate-Palmolive, FHI 360, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Procter & Gamble, UNICEF, Unilever, University at Buffalo, USAID, the Water and Sanitation Program of the World Bank, and the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council. It's through the generous support of these organizations that we are able to undertake handwashing advocacy and knowledge leadership activities such as the think tank. So before we go to the presentations, I want to go over a few logistical items. If you are on Twitter, please feel free to share your thoughts and reflections using the hashtag HandwashingThinkTank. You can find the PPPHW at handwashingsoap. Your microphone will be muted during presentations, but we will allow time for question and answers at the end. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to type them in the chat box and we'll answer them at the end of the presentations. And if any questions aren't answered at that time, we will get you responses later. Also, a recording of the webinar is going to be made available on our website, which is globalhandwashing.org, and you'll also be able to find links to the recordings on our social media channels. Next slide, please. So this is the agenda for our webinar today. First, we're going to talk about integration of handwashing into other programs. We're going to talk about settings and the impact settings can have on behavior change, scale and sustainability, and then talk about what we believe the way forward is, and then allow time for question and answers. So the objectives of the think tank were to explore the current knowledge about handwashing with soap, spark collaborative thinking about handwashing, and drive forward the sector. So this is also what we hope to accomplish with this webinar, is to help share ideas about what we're thinking about handwashing, get your feedback, and hopefully learn how we can move forward together. Next slide, please. So why handwashing? The lack of handwashing is a global risk. The facts of handwashing are clear, and we know it prevents illness, including influenza, diarrhea, and pneumonia, but its benefits are much broader as well. It has impact on education, nutrition, equity, in addition to health. It's also effective, affordable, and accessible. Yet, despite the clear benefits of hygiene and handwashing, it far too often is not prioritized. That includes at the personal level, people simply don't wash their hands, and at the policy level, it's often overlooked. However, we are encouraged because handwashing is gaining prominence on the global stage. With Target 6.2 of the new Sustainable Development Goals that the global community agreed to last year, we're called upon to achieve access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene for all by 2030. This is great news, but if we hope to reach this worthwhile goal, we must break out of our business-as-usual approach. This is especially true for hygiene, which was not included in the previous Millennium Development Goals. To achieve the Sustainable Development Goal around sanitation and hygiene, we must take stock of behavior change, identify the gaps, and explore how we can translate our knowledge into action. It was in pursuit of these ends that we, along with WaterAid and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, co-sponsored and convened the Handwashing Think Tank. So the first thematic area that we discussed is that of integration, and I am going to speak on that topic. So what is integration? Integration includes incorporating handwashing promotion into related programs that have similar goals and objectives. We believe that integration makes sense because it allows us to harness synergies, collaborate with our colleagues who have similar goals, and hopefully be less duplicative in our programming. At the think tank, we discussed integration into 3 key areas: newborn care, nutrition, and sanitation. But handwashing can also be integrated into other sectors such as education. So please do keep that in mind that this isn't comprehensive. So first, I'm going to start to talk about why we should promote handwashing integration with newborn care. So this at the think tank, we had experts that presented on each of the thematic areas, and Dr. Pavani Ram from the University at Buffalo, who unfortunately had competing commitments and isn't able to join us today, presented on integrating handwashing with newborn care. And so those slides are built off of the ones that she presented. So we know that there are a lot of behaviors that are important for newborn health and well-being, and handwashing is just one component of newborn care. So I think that's really important to remember that we're not promoting handwashing at the expense of other components of health, but in addition. So we know that theoretically that having a new baby causes a disruption in routine in the household. And as such, it presents an opportunity for a household to adapt a new habit of hand washing. But the evidence shows that this isn't necessarily what happens in reality. And even if there are modest gains in hand washing behavior, they're oftentimes not permanent. So I think that this is really important because there's a number of challenges that are presented in forming the hand washing habit. Next slide. So what are some barriers to integrating hand washing in newborn care? Well, if there's not already an existing social norm or habit around hand washing, getting families to uptake a hand washing habit requires robust interventions. So that can be very burdensome, especially if there's a new baby. There's a lot of work that needs to be done around the household to take care of the new baby, and so this can be very difficult. Also, there's a lack of evidence about whose hands should be washed and cleansed. So oftentimes hand washing promotion programs in this context promote hand washing for the mother, but what about the father or another key caregiver such as the mother-in-law? We don't know to what extent their hands we should be promoting hand cleansing by those audiences. Also, as mentioned, this period there's a lot of competing priorities. We're asking mothers to breastfeed, do other activities, and so it's very difficult to promote another thing that we're asking them to do. And then also there's a limited evidence base for hand washing in this period. So this is another barrier that we see. Next slide, please. So what about the barriers to actually hand washing? Mothers and newborns face many challenges when they're home. So they have competing priorities. They may not already have existing materials such as a hand washing station with soap and water that's convenient for them to use, and a lack of a pre-existing habit. So it's a big barrier that mothers face and that we should consider for promoting integration in this context. Also, there's not a agreement upon the critical times for hand washing with this population. So is it before breastfeeding, when the child is already ill, and then also the hand cleanliness of others that are involved in the household. And then also we need to find a balance between feasibility of the behavior along with product costs. So if there's not hand washing stations, what are the barriers that households are going to face to develop those and maintain them? Next slide, please. So the next topic of integration that was presented at the think tank was integrating hand washing into nutrition. And this was presented by Sandy Collier, who's the director of the USAID Wash Plus project, which is a sister project here. And she spoke about the impact of integrating hand washing in nutrition. I imagine that many of you are already familiar with the role that hand washing can play in nutrition. There's a lot of conversations happening because of various projects and initiatives around integration in this setting. So we know that there's a vicious cycle of diarrhea and undernutrition, and that wash and nutrition are linked. So increasingly the sectors are working together. children with diarrhea tend to eat less, and then when they have diarrhea, the nutrients that they, from the food they do eat, are not well absorbed, and so this causes them to be undernourished, which makes them more susceptible to diarrhea. So that's the vicious cycle. So there are a number of projects that are working on linking hand washing to improve child feeding practices, including the Alive and Thrive project, the Spring project, and the USAID Wash Plus project. Next slide, please. So this slide gets at, again, why it's important to promote hand washing in this context, because diarrhea accounts for 9% of all child deaths, but undernutrition contributes to 73% of these deaths. So clearly there's a linkage between diarrheal deaths and undernutrition, and hand washing is important to help keep children healthy and prevent diarrhea. Next slide. So there are challenges in integrating hand washing and nutrition that you can see here on this slide. I think that the ones that I think are really interesting in this context are thinking about how the behavior of hand washing after defecation is different than the behavior of hand washing before preparing food. So the motivators might be different, so we need to consider that when we're promoting hand washing in nutrition programs. And then also there's multiple behaviors that need to be changed. So it's not just a single behavior, but there's multiple. So especially if you think about preparing food, it's not necessarily a one-step process. It's linear, it goes over a period of time, and so there might be multiple junctions in which hand washing should occur. So in implementing integrated hand washing and nutrition programs, there's challenges both around the how and the why. So where should hand washing stations be located? And then also the question of products. How can we make hand washing aspirational through products? And then lastly, at the big kind of macro level, wash and nutrition certainly have linkages that are practical, but they are distinct disciplines and different evidence. There are different government ministers that are responsible for wash and nutrition. There's different approaches and then also different ways of measuring success. So these are challenges that we face in integrating in this context. Next slide, please. So lastly, integrating hand washing in CLTS and sanitation was presented by Caroline Vandervoorden with the WSSCC, and they are doing a lot of work around community-led total sanitation, or CLTS. For those of you who might not be familiar, here's some information on CLTS. Basically, it is a way to bring the whole community into addressing the issue of open defecation and moving from defecating in the open to using sanitation. So it's very much a community-led process that rallies the community around key outcomes. Because it is so community-led, that presents some challenges, but also we know that CLTS is a really good opportunity to integrate hand washing, because increasingly hand washing is becoming an integral part of CLTS. So the certification of communities being open defecation free might not require hand washing stations to be present near latrines or used, but this is increasingly changing, that it is becoming part of the certification of being open defecation free. So we know that good community-led total sanitation leads to positive improvements, both in the knowledge of critical hand washing times, the ability to demonstrate the critical times, and then also a greater likelihood that hand washing stations with soap and water are present by latrines. Next slide, please. So there's numerous opportunities for integrating hand washing and sanitation. CLTS programs focus on creating a movement, so there's strong community engagement, which means that there's also the likelihood of further integration and kind of long-term work around sanitation and hygiene. And so that's encouraging for the sustainability of programs and hopefully the continued use of a good hand washing behavior. Also, in terms of the Sustainable Development Goal, it's clear that sanitation and hygiene are linked. And so that's a really key opportunity that if we're going to achieve sanitation for all, that must also include hygiene. So the proposed indicator of percentage of population using sanitation services includes a hand washing facility with soap and water. So clearly at the policy level, sanitation and hygiene are definitely linked, but I think that it's important to ensure that this happens at the practical level, that we're not just saying sanitation, but that we're also mentioning sanitation and hygiene. Next slide, please. And so what are the challenges? Measuring hand washing is a significant challenge that we discussed at Think Tank over the day and a half. That the reliability of indicators, ensuring that people don't just have access to hand washing stations, but they're actually using them. It's very difficult to measure and complicated. So this is an area that we need to work on going forward. We also know that more needs to be done on the triggering tools of integration, so making sure that programs aren't just talking about hygiene as kind of an afterthought, but it's really being included in CLTS programs. There's gaps in terms of the how of implementing hand washing in CLTS programs. Again, measurement of hand washing facilities, knowledge and use. And then also, it's not clear when exactly hand washing should be introduced into the CLTS process, if there's kind of a best practice about going about doing this. And then also we need greater evidence about the effectiveness of CLTS approach and the individual components, including hand washing. Next slide, please. So the second thematic area that we discussed at the think tank was that of behavioral settings. And Dr. Bob Unger from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine is going to give an overview of what was presented in this part of the think tank.
Thanks very much, Hannah. Actually, Dr. Omsad Gautam was expected to be doing this, so I stepped in at the last minute, and I'm going to be using his slides, but he sends his apologies. He's in Tanzania with very poor internet connection. But I'm happy to be presenting on this concept of behavior setting, which is a concept that comes from ecological psychology in the 1950s, which we think is a very powerful concept for behavior change. And if I could have the next slide, please. It starts with an understanding of the fact that behavior is situated, and one way in which behavior is situated is that it's situated in the context of other behaviors. And we can see this in this slide, where we collected information from about 25 rural Indian women about the things that they did from the moment they woke up in the morning until they went to bed at night. And when you compare the observations of what they were doing, they line up very significantly. So basically all the different women that we asked are doing roughly the same thing in roughly the same order. And you can see that their behaviors are clustered in terms of their functional sorts of purposes. So basically these women are doing a variety of hygiene behaviors when they first wake up, like defecating and doing a kind of ritualized semi-wash and then sweeping the house and brushing their teeth and so on. Then they do a variety of food prep behaviors and then childcare, etc. So you can see both that behavior is organized in a very specific way and that it's clustered. We can have the next slide, please. So the behavior setting concept is a way of understanding the way that behavior is organized to achieve particular kinds of functional ends. And this is obviously a picture of hand washing taking place in a particular context. What the behavior setting concept provides you is a very kind of succinct way of thinking about all the different factors that might play a role in determining behavior in a particular context. The concept of context itself is very vague, but a setting is actually very specific in that it specifies a number of things that you have to look at and how they interrelate to one another. So if we begin with the kind of physical aspects of it, we can think about all behaviors as taking place in a stage or a place, which has various kinds of characteristics, one of which is that there might be certain kinds of infrastructure which are crucial to performance of the target behavior. In this case, for hand washing, you're going to need some water, and so you need a water supply. You'll also need props because what we're interested in promoting is hand washing with soap, and you can't perform hand washing with soap behaviors without soap. You obviously can't do it without a body to actually engage in the behavior. And when we think about the behavioral sequence, we can think about that as a routine because it's often done in roughly the same order. So behaviors are structured in a particular sequence. And this routine is directed by what we call a script, which is in the people's heads. And which routine that they perform depends on which script they have, and which script they have depends on what role they're playing in the setting. So in this particular depiction of hand washing, we have people playing two different roles. The older sibling is playing the teacher role, and the younger sibling is playing the learner role. And each of them will be doing slightly different things as a function of those roles and the script that tells them what things to be doing in this particular setting. And the final component that you need to look at from the behavior setting perspective is what we're calling a control mechanism. So associated with the script and the role, which are psychological factors, are potentially the social factors, like this control mechanism. So the way that the teacher and the learner interact is prescribed in certain ways, and if either of them doesn't perform their script in the proper way, so that in this case the learner's obviously not doing exactly what he should be doing at this point, you can exert control over the performance of other people's roles by this kind of overt teaching, or by censuring people, or other forms of social control. And this is a really important aspect of behavior settings, and one which we can actually use by changing norms, for example, associated with different roles. If I could have the next slide, please. And so the behavior setting concept actually has utility in behavior change, and it's been demonstrated by Dr. Gautam's PhD research on food hygiene in Nepal, where he did a trial trying to promote 5 different food hygiene behaviors simultaneously. And you can see some of them there, including hand washing, but also keeping utensils clean, reheating food before serving, proper storage of food prior to serving, and so on. Next slide, please. And you can see that a typical household in Nepal presents certain kinds of physical challenges for remaining hygienic during food preparation and serving. It's quite obvious in this slide, I hope. So there are various challenges that need to be overcome, and the question is, how can we do this? Well, Om's central idea was that because all of these are taking place in roughly the same sort of stage, that is, this corner of people's homes, you could attack the hygiene promotion issue by transforming or disrupting the setting. Next slide, please. And so he did this in various ways. He explicitly tried to modify the scripts in people's heads by adding various behaviors to the sequence of the proper sequence of what people need to go through in order to successfully complete food preparation. So that would include cleaning of utensils and proper storage of food, for example. So you would make the sequence of behaviors that people need to do a little bit more complicated, but which would result in hygienic practices. He also suggested that people engage in transformation of the physical stage, as you can see from the original kind of picture to the transformed setting, where a variety of things were undertaken through kitchen makeovers by the community themselves to turn this into an area that's both clean and almost symbolically pure in a way, and that led to sustained behavior change. Finally, the social norms associated with playing the role of a food preparer or a food server was changed through pledging activities and in a group context where everyone agreed, much like CLTS kinds of situations, to together perform and ensure each other performs the target behaviors. Next slide, please. So basically changing the scripts was done through a variety of activities, including games, storytelling, folk songs, which are important in Nepalese society, this commitment ceremony, using visual reminders in the kitchens that have been transformed, so that all this would result hopefully in habit formation. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, there are a variety of ways in which he transformed the physical setting. Well, not he, but the women in the village transformed their own kitchens, and that included a variety of artifacts that he designed that would serve as reminders and aids to performance of the target behaviors. Next slide. So as seen, the visual result is basically a new kind of space within which all of these behaviors were taking place, and the transformation of it in this way with the reminders and the fact that it looks visually quite distinct. It's now a separate space in the house, led to people being promoted to perform these various behaviors. Next slide. So here you see the basic results for the 5 target behaviors, starting from a very low baseline, that there was highly significant increases in the performance of the entire suite of behaviors, with an overall increase from 1% in the population to 43%. That's the first bar there, before and after. Next slide. So similar kinds of approach has been taken by Robert Drivelbis with respect to school related hand washing. So after using the latrine, well, the toilets in the schools, he set up a system where the hand wash stand was provided, and then various nudges in the sense of the footprints and the hands, and the kind of gay coloring of the facilities transformed the probability that the kids were going to actually do this behavior from a very low baseline again to quite a high level that was sustained 6 weeks post-intervention. Next slide. And so similar kinds of things are now being done again in Nepal by Om and his WaterAid colleagues to promote hygiene behaviors through routine immunization programs. So they get contact with populations through the immunization program, but then they piggyback on that variety of hygiene promotion efforts. Next slide. So just to conclude, it's obvious from these examples that and from the prior academic work that settings dictate how and what behaviors people perform in particular contexts, and it provides you a very nice way of thinking about how you can encourage behavior change by transforming or disrupting the current settings. You really need, though, to understand how these settings work through formative research. It's very difficult to know without observation how the dynamics of these things operate. So formative research plays a key role in being able to use this for behavior change, as does the kind of creative activities that Om used. So the other aspect of this is that it makes it possible to promote multiple behaviors simultaneously by changing a single setting and using various kinds of promotional mechanisms.
Great, thank you.
I'm going to pass to Val now. No.
Yep, so our next speaker is Dr. Val Curtis, and she's going to discuss scale and sustainability.
Hi everybody, I just wanted to say thanks to Hannah and Bob and to everybody at the think tank, which was actually, I'm sorry you couldn't all be there, but it was a really inspiring couple of days. We all learnt a terrific amount from it. I've been asked to speak basically about what 3 speakers talked about, scale and sustainability. Can I have the next slide? The three issues I want to talk about are different routes to scale and sustainability. So going to scale through large-scale programs and getting to sustainability through large-scale programs that are sustainable because they create sustainable businesses. So these are two different ways of achieving hand washing success. Ingeborg Krukut presented the results of an evaluation of BRAC's work in Bangladesh over the last, how many years is that? 9 years. It was a huge program, had a lot of international support, but also a lot of national support. It's reached over 39 million people, and it's promoted hygiene to nearly 14 million people every year during that program. Next slide. And though we don't have excellent data that allows us to attribute exactly what difference BRAC's program made, this current graph shows you a little bit of the trends that have been happening in the upper Zillas where the intervention has taken place. So if you start with the bars on the right-hand side, you can see that the rate of, if you look at the blue graph, you can see an upper Zilla that has had an intervention for only 1.5 years has rates of hygienic latrine building at around 30%, whereas if you've had an intervention in your upper Zilla for more than 3 years or 8 years, you have a much higher rate of hygienic latrine provision in your household. And if you look at hand wash, we don't actually have hand washing data as such, but we have provision of hand washing facilities. And again, there's a similar trend where you're going from about 45% who having hand wash facilities at their toilets to more like 69% when the intervention has been going for as long as 8 years. Next slide, please. Ingeborg also pulled in some of the data from my colleague Sandy Cairncross and work that was done with IRC to look at the long-term sustainability of hygiene behavior change. And there's, from a number of different programs, there's a very clear correlation between rates of hand washing and the rates and the amount of and intensity of support that's been given to hand washing promotion programs. So if you want, so I think the next slide tells us that the lessons that we can learn from, next slide please, the lessons that we can learn from such programs as to what works are that we need integrated approach. I mean, it's very hard to say exactly which of these elements are the elements that have led to long-term success and sustainability in these programs, but BRAC attribute their success to having an integrated approach, to having quite intense inputs and a specific allocated budget for hygiene. I think Bangladesh is really quite a special country in the sense it has had a lot of success with a low level of resource in total in the country in achieving very good sanitation coverage and good and high rates of hand washing. And because the country has really emphasized it. I mean, there is a cadre of hygiene promoters that almost every village knows who their hygiene promoter is, and that's very unusual. I don't think I know any other country where hygiene promoters are so common. But they also say that that's because of very close linkages with the community, because of linkages with the private sector, and because of good linkages with local government that makes the efforts sustainable. And there have been also efforts at making it financially easier for people to get their toilets. Next slide, please. The second presentation that we had in this session was one from our colleague Cheryl Hicks, who is the Executive Director of the Toilet Board Coalition, which has a mission to accelerate innovative business solutions to deliver sanitation scale to those who need it most by innovating at the social, environmental, economic and organizational level. So this is a business organization whose the approach they use is to encourage businesses who want to move into the sanitation space. We know that this is a huge business opportunity. Half of India still needs toilets. The population of Africa is doubling. Part of what the toilet board is doing is trying to reach out to businesses and show them that this is an opportunity. But the second thing they're trying to do is to help catalyze these businesses in the sanitation space. So slide 2, the next slide please, talks a little bit about the co-innovation process that they use. They have a pipeline of innovations in the sanitation business space, but it's not just about business innovations, as we'll see in a minute. It's also about how you can. I think when people think about innovation in the toilet space, they think hardware, they think tools, they think new types of toilet. But can we go on to the next slide? And indeed, a new type of toilet, for example, the Clean Team solution, which some of you may know about, is important. You've got to have something that consumers like. It's got to be easy to use. It's got to be something you can mass produce easily. But beyond all of those things, it has to be a model which is sustainable so that someone can make a profit from it. And that means you've got to be able to reach your consumer. You've got to be able to market your product to your consumer. You've got to be able to, in a project like Clean Team, you've got to be able to collect the wastes. You've got to be able to deal with the waste sustainably. You've got to be able to keep a sales force happy, and you need to separate your sales and set your sales from the people who are actually collecting the toilet waste for consumer acceptability reasons. And you need a franchise model so that a project like this, where you have we were at about 2,000 units in Kumasi, can spread across the country and spread across the world. Next slide, please. So the reason that we invited Cheryl and Unilever to come and talk about this is because I think many of you may not be aware of how extraordinary an opportunity we have in the sanitation space at the moment. As Hannah alluded to, we have Sustainable Development Goals agreed for universal access to sanitation. But in the last month, the Statistical Commission for the UN has agreed the indicators that should go with that. And the indicator in principle for sustainable sanitation is to have a hand washing facility associated with the toilet. Now that means that countries that already have quite high toilet coverage, if they don't have good hand wash facility coverage, are going to go right back to square one. They'll be, instead of talking about 70 or 80% coverage, they'll be talking about 20 or 30% coverage. Countries are going to, actually some of the countries are quite annoyed about this and are going to push quite hard back at it. But I think we, as the hand wash world, have to make sure that we don't lose any ground on this. So people in the toilet board, for example, are now realizing that they need to rise to that challenge. This is a huge business opportunity. And they're going to launch an Open on Innovation Challenge for technologies and business models in the hand washing space. So we'll see in the next month or so that challenge being proposed, and we'll circulate it to the PPP hand washes circulation lists, and we will be looking for thoughts and for you to disseminate that widely, particularly in the business community, so that we can find new businesses and new business models in the hand washing space. And here's an example. Slide next, please. This is the Labobo. We heard from Jeff Revel from Watershed Asia about this system that they've been working on now for the last 5 years or so. It's dubbed the Happy Tap, the world's first purpose-built, mass-produced hand-washing station, which was, again, developed through a rigorous design and iterative testing process using human-centered design. It has the right mix of aesthetic appeal, functionality, durability, and affordability, at least for certain audiences. But next slide. But they have major challenges. Jeff says that he could sell millions of this if he could just get people in front of it, because when he gets people in front of it and they get a chance to use it, they love it. But he's not getting enough support to get marketing of this device out there. And the real challenges are not so much the technology for this device. There are certainly tweaks that would make it better, and there will be other versions of this technology. But the main problems really for him are the whole issue of retail distribution and marketing. And as he and Cheryl insisted. It's the business model that we need to get better at if we're going to find sustainable solutions to hand washing through technologies that are available in the mass market for everybody. Next slide, please. So the conclusions from this section are that hand washing, if you want sustainability and scale, it's not cheap, and it's not easy, and it's not short term. If you want all those benefits that you can get from hand washing, we're going to have to invest in it seriously, and players are going to have to invest in it seriously. And as we've heard previously from Hannah, there's lots of opportunities for doing that. We can invest seriously in the newborn moment, we can invest seriously in the nutrition space, and we can invest seriously in the CLTS opportunity as well. We still have some challenges in that integration space. It's not always the same sort of hand washing. The evidence base is a little bit thin, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done on all of that. We need to move from health education, which is still the standard model in hand washing promotion, in newborn, in nutrition, and in CLTS, to much more effective approaches that use things like emotional approaches and use things like settings. We need to make sure that it's not just tagged on, that it is central to these programs. If that's how we're going to get sustained progress. Settings are also a means of sustainably changing behavior. If you can ensure that you disrupt that setting, and that behavioral setting actually controls 90% of all of our behavior all of the time. So if we can disrupt those settings, get hand washing behavior routines and habits permanently altered to a sustainable way to change behavior. Settings are a brilliant tool for changing settings, for changing behaviors, such as changing daily routine behaviors such as hand washing sustainably. Businesses provide great opportunities for hand wash change. We need innovation, and we need business models that work. So those are some of the means by which we hope to take hand washing to the next level, which is the challenge for the Global Public-Private Partnership for Hand Washing and the SDGs. Thank you, Hannah. Hand it back to you.
Great, thank you, Val, and thank you for that really good summary of the session. I think that your point about how hand washing needs to be central is very well received, and I think that's a lot of the outcome that I took from the think tank, was that we really do need to make sure that hand washing is not an afterthought, but that it's something that we are prioritizing in programs and in policy, because the challenge that the SDGs has put forth is very big, and we will need to make sure that we respond accordingly. I think in terms of identifying the way forward, integration, I think that from my perspective of attending the think tank, some takeaways that I had was that we do need more evidence around integration, but we need to make sure that we're also acting, and we're acting on the evidence that we do have. And then I think you both did a really nice job summarizing kind of what's next for both behavioral settings and scale and sustainability. So we have about 10 minutes left in the webinar, so I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague Bij, who is going to manage the question and answer portion in the chat of the webinar. So Bij, you want to take it away?
Hi, we have a couple of questions. I am going to start with the beginning. The first question is, we saw changes in settings in using examples of Southern Asia, like in Bangladesh. But what about changing behaviors in regions that, such as Sub-Saharan Africa, where hand washing poses just as big problems, but may not follow the same scripts or changes of behaviors?
Yep, I think that's an excellent question. There's issues around identification of the appropriate setting for such cases. I mean, it's quite often the case, for example, if you want to hand washing with soap after defecation, that people are defecating outside the home environment and then coming back and unlikely to take soap and water with them to the defecation site. So you may have a very specific kind of physical challenge there in that people are coming back and then immediately engaging in other kinds of behaviors, starting to do other things. But it's always a case where you have to bring together all the props and the infrastructure that you need to get the behavior done, and then promote the kind of psychological aspects. So if it is the case that people are coming back from the field or wherever, you have to get them in that moment and figure out a way to create a setting that will result in the behavior reliably being performed, and as Val says, probably turned into a habit by being connected to a particular setting.
It doesn't matter what location, the principle of settings is the same. All behavior, pretty much all behavior, takes place in settings. Identifying what those factors are in settings that are controlling behavior and then trying to disrupt them is a key task for all of us. And it works in your own home. Settings work in controlling your behavior and your hygiene behavior in your own home as much as they do in Africa, as they do in India or anywhere else in the world.
I'm going to move on to the next question. In terms of scale and sustainability, how do implementers and designers of programs go about managing competing players such as civil society, government agencies, and businesses to work together?
That's a great question. I'm currently working in Myanmar to try and bring together all of the different actors in nutrition, in WASH, in maternal health, and in the private sector, and in government, and all the different NGOs. It's a massive challenge, particularly as we're all, and also in healthcare settings, so the midwives and the and schools. So you have very different settings, very different actors, and you have different types of hand washing behavior that people want to promote. Nevertheless, there's a huge groundswell of desire to do this. So I just called a large sector meeting for everybody who was interested in hand washing, and we had a room full of people and huge enthusiasm to try and do something together. So at least the enthusiasm and motivation, the evidence is there, the desire is there to do it. So actually the next step is how do we actually drill down to a core set of principles and things that we all actually want to do. And how do we, harder is actually is getting, there's lots of resources available for hand washing, but that's all piecemeal as well. And so trying to get people to contribute to a common pot is difficult. You particularly need someone, a coordinator at the center, to try and pull all this together and keep everybody pulling together. And nobody wants to fund that sort of bit. They all want to fund the actual hand washing promotion. But I do believe that with careful thought and with a carefully planned approach that has some vision and leadership about where we can get to if we do all work together, great things can be achieved. There's a lot of devil in the detail, of course, but it's the goodwill and the political will in the first place that will help us get through the devils in the details.
Thank you, Val, for that great response. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is, there are cases of cooking areas not being enclosed in an enclosed space in Western Africa. Will the principle of settings still apply in such cases?
Yeah, I think we sort of answered that before. Yeah, a lot of people tend to cook outside, but typically in the same spot, like in front of their house or in a separate secondary structure. Again, it's the same principles apply because you're doing the same thing in roughly the same context every day. All you need to do is understand that context using the specific aspects of the behavior setting concept, and hopefully you can find a way into changing the relevant behaviors.
If you think about cooking, whether it's in Africa or whether it's in Asia or whether it's in your own home, what cooking is about is a set of instructions, a script that you've inherited from your mother or your aunt or your great-great-grandmother or your sister. There's a script about how you go about doing it. And that is as much a determinant of how you behave when you cook. It's recipes, if you like, but it's more than recipes. It's a sort of beliefs about what the right way to feed your children is. These are very strongly anchored in women's heads, and to try and change them by saying to them, oh, look, you're going to make your child sick if you don't wash your hands before you prepare food. That's really, it doesn't work. What you've got to do is somehow get into that script of how people think the right way to cook is. And whether it's around 3 stones or whether it's at my fancy cooker here in the UK with my gas stove and all my knobs, I'm not going to change that behavior unless somebody gets inside my head and gives me a very powerful emotional reason to change it, to change that script. So
hopefully without destroying the tradition idea.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So if you tell me I'm doing a bad job, I'm not going to change my cooking. I'm going to throw you out. If you tell me that I might just improve it, then it might be, and my kids might be happier, and if you...
Your grandma would approve.
My grandma would approve, and if you give me a new saucepan that helps me clean it up better, or give me with a better lid, that means that I can keep the flies off it more easily. These are sorts of things that are going to change my behavior. I think it's really important to emphasize that the word settings sounds like the physical settings, but it's not. It's a composite of all of these factors that control behavior. And very important is the social control. It's not just the physical objects and infrastructure. It's the social, it's the roles that you play that you've learnt from childhood. It's the scripts that you've rehearsed again and again that you control your behavior in your head. And it's very powerfully what other people think of you. If you try and, we learnt to take an example from Zambia, we were doing some behavior trials with mothers, and we asked them to do some hand washing with soap and show us how they did it. And while we were filming the mothers doing it, we were listening to some other, this was done on the front step, and a load of other mothers were standing around watching, and they were saying, what's going on? What is that woman doing? Why is she washing her hands with soap? Oh my goodness, who does she think she is? Does she think she's better than us? Does she, oh my gosh, giving it to her children. Look how she's wasting the soap. Isn't that stupid? And we learned from that, from just overhearing that conversation, that the social norm in those villages in Lusaka, near Lusaka, was not to wash hands with soap. You were a social outcast if you wash hands with soap because people thought you were getting uppity. So it's just as important to change those sets of social, to change the social control mechanisms as it is to change the physical settings of behavior.
We will have time for one more question, which is, it was emphasized the need for investment in budget allocations, but most implementation agencies are resource scarce. How do we trigger new thinking from conventional hygiene education programs into integrated approaches?
That's a big question. We don't have a full answer to it, but I have a kind of a partial answer. When people ask me about how to do advocacy, I say we need to do 2 things. We need to go for people's hearts and people's heads. So if you're going to do successful advocacy, first of all, you need to come with a good story, which is how people learn, but by emotion. So you want your politician to get it. You show them an example of a great hand washing program that has worked. You show them the film that you used. You show them the pictures of the happy kids, like this picture of happy kids. You tell them the story that makes them see why what you're doing is better than the same old boring old stuff that people always do. One colleague, I won't name her, but she said very loudly at the Hand Wash Summit, most of what we do is rubbish and we need to do it better. So we need examples of doing it really well that grabs people's imaginations and grabs their hearts. And then we need the evidence that it does work to change behavior. So you need to go with 2 things. You need to go with a nice PowerPoint slideshow with a film that shows you how behavior change works, and you need to go with a graph like OMS data, for example, that shows how much behavior change you can get. So those are 2 advocacy tools that I try to use together to influence people to invest in hand washing. But that's not really, I don't know, Hannah, have you got any more thoughts to add on that?
In program context, you need a creative
creative innovation. Anna, do we have any more thoughts?
I think that's really good. I think I would add that I think it's important to incorporate a number of actors, so ensuring that we do have representation from not just civil society but also academic institutions and the private sector, and really try to catalyze a range of organizations around the issue, because we know that we have a more powerful voice when we speak together, and we're able to achieve more when we work together. And so I think that's something that I would add. I think I really like the way that you frame it as addressing the head and the heart, because I think that's really critical. So if that's all that we have in terms of questions, we're just about out of time, but I do want to mention that a number of the materials from the think tank are available on our website. So if you go to globalhandwashing.org, click on Learn, the Handwashing Think Tank is under the key topics area, so you can access presentations, reports from each day of the 2016 think tank, as well as access links to download presentations from think tanks from prior years. So also on our website we have a number of materials for implementers, including a distance learning course. We have research summaries that are published on a quarterly basis, and a number of other documents that hopefully you can find useful. So I want to thank you, Bob and Val, for taking the time to speak on these topics with me, and I want to thank everyone who attended. I hope you were able to learn a little bit more about what we're thinking in terms of integration, settings, and scale and sustainability for hand washing behavior change, and hopefully it inspired you and you learned something that you can take back to your projects and organizations. So if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are best at contact@globalhandwashing.org. That's our email address. Or you can find us on social media at Handwashing Soap. Thank you all very much for your time, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Take care.
Bye.